The future of America is in their hands. Election Day 2002. The fight for control of Congress is coming to a nervous and volatile finish as the voting ends and the counting begins.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather reporting from CBS News election headquarters in New York.
Good evening. Americans today are setting this country's course for the next few years, at least those Americans who are exercising their right to vote. There's a lot at stake, including control of Congress and the nation's agenda and the future of the judicial system. CBS News has assembled an experienced team of correspondents to bring you the returns and analysis tonight, and we could be in for a long time with the Senate battle as tight as a Botox smile. It may be days before we know whether the Democrats hold the Senate or the Republicans take it back. President Bush voted today at a firehouse in his hometown of Crawford, Texas, after traveling to 15 states in just 5 days, trying to win control of both houses of Congress. His last stops were in Missouri and Arkansas, with two of the closest of 34 Senate races nationwide. Besides Missouri and Arkansas, others include Colorado, Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, North Carolina, New Hampshire, South Dakota, and Minnesota. Former Vice President Walter Mondale became the Democratic nominee in Minnesota after Senator Paul Wellstone died in a plane crash last month. Also being decided, all 435 House seats, 36 governorships, and more than 200 propositions in 40 states. As always in midterm elections, voter turnout is a critical element.
I'd like to vote today.
But despite terrorism, the economy, and other problems facing the nation, some analysts predicted an even worse turnout than 1998. But the turnout did appear to be at least reasonably good in Florida, where Governor Jeb Bush, the president's brother, found himself in a rugged re-election fight. Floridians may also have been drawn to the polls by new high-tech voting equipment designed to avoid a repeat of the election fiasco of 2000. We'll be saying it often tonight. The big battle of this election year is for control of Congress. Here's a way to look at it and think about it. There are 34 Senate races up. The Republicans must win 21 to regain control of the Senate. Following that story for us is the veteran Bob Schieffer. Bob, how does it look?
Well, Dan, I'll tell you something. There are not many sure bets this year, but here are two fairly safe ones. The Republicans will retain their slim majority in the House, and it may be late tonight or even later before we have any idea who controls the Senate. Why can we be so sure about the House? It's because after the 2000 census, congressional districts were redrawn, and incumbents in both parties turned the exercise into an Incumbents Protection Act. Over and over, they redrew the lines to make it harder for challengers to beat them. That left only a handful of competitive races, so few it is virtually impossible for Democrats to win enough to take a majority. As for the Senate, you've already mentioned all those races that are too close to call. Now factor in the almost certain possibility of lawsuits. The polls hadn't even closed in New Hampshire and South Dakota, and the parties were already calling for recounts there. There will almost certainly be legal challenges as well in Minnesota. So the way this is going so far, Dan, it may be next week before we know which party controls the Senate.
Bob Schieffer, thanks. No one has more writing on the outcome of this election than a man whose name is not on the ballot, President George W. Bush. He has a chance to control not only the White House, but now the two houses of Congress, plus a clear majority on the U.S. Supreme Court. CBS's John Roberts reports the president will be glued to the television tonight. John?
Dan, after his whirlwind campaign swing, President Bush is back at the White House tonight, where he'll watch the election returns along with some prominent Republican leaders. And in contests that could turn on turnout, as you said earlier, Republicans say they are pleased with what they've been seeing so far in key states like South Dakota and Missouri.
President Bush gave a cautious thumbs up this morning, casting his vote for Republicans in his home state of Texas. But the president's aides are anything but cautious in their characterization of how they think this election will go.
I'm expecting some history to be made. It's just a question of what that is exactly. If we keep the House, which I think right now the odds are that we do, that already is historic.
The history Mr. Bush would like to write is that of taking back control of Congress, an event unprecedented in a president's first midterm. He's made an extraordinary investment toward that goal, campaigning in 35 states, raising a record $145 million for the Republican war chest. Vice President Cheney added another $22 million in dozens of appearances. Even First Lady Laura Bush set aside her distaste for all things political to headline a few rallies. But perhaps the two biggest advantages President Bush had this year, he avoided blame for a bad economy that could have sunk him and managed to keep his approval rating in the mid-60s, which White House officials like to point out is higher than any president has enjoyed since John Kennedy's first midterm in 1962.
In that 1962 election, Kennedy lost just 4 seats in the House but gained 3 in the Senate. Even with all the optimism here tonight, that may be a performance that's difficult for this White House to beat. Dan?
Well, John Roberts, we'll see. John reporting live from the White House. Now we take you to Florida, where President Bush has raised a lot of money and put his personal prestige on the line, campaigning frequently for his brother's re-election as governor. CBS's Byron Pitts is covering that contest for us tonight. Byron?
Well, Dan, the governor's race is tight, but the big surprise tonight, Election Day in Florida. It's gone better than expected.
Bill McBride, the Democratic candidate for governor, in a race not just against an incumbent, he says, but the White House as well.
People have been in line all day since yesterday, and that's a good sign for our campaign.
And Republican Governor Jeb Bush, the president's brother, and #1 target of the National Democratic Party. Today, pleased with Florida's new touchscreen voting machines.
The machines are easy to vote on.
The governor's assessment almost universal.
I think it's really an improvement.
An improvement over the chaos of 2000, when Hanging Chad stalled the presidential election for weeks. Today, more smiles than glitches.
I pressed one name and another name came up.
But high praise from Election Day monitors.
By and large, this has been, compared to, especially to the primary election in September, a very problem-free election.
Voter turnout in Florida could reach 60%. That's a high number for a midterm election. Dan?
Byron Pitts reporting live from Miami. Joining us now, CBS News correspondent Leslie Stahl, who will be keeping tabs tonight on the 36 governor's races around the country. Leslie?
Dan, unlike the situation in the House, it could be a tough night for incumbents in the governor's races, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. With most states facing economic slumps and budget meltdowns, the voters are blaming the parties in power. But there's a slew of fresh faces to choose from, including a new breed of women candidates.
I see a Michigan where the leadership doesn't just offer lip service, but maybe it actually wears lipstick.
Michigan Attorney General Jennifer Granholm is one of 10 women running for governor, 9 Democrats and 1 Republican. Governorships have been a political glass ceiling, with voters less willing to trust women with the state's top job. But this year, women are running on their credentials as Attorney General, state treasurers, or lieutenant governors. The lieutenant governor in Maryland, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, Bobby Kennedy's daughter, thought she'd have an easy race in this strongly Democratic state, but the Republicans have made her a top target.
I'll put the people of Kansas before anything else.
In Republican states like Kansas, Arizona, and Alaska, moderate, Democratic, pro-choice women hope to win by dominating the women's vote against ultra-conservatives. The men in these races are not conceding the female vote. In Massachusetts, Republican Mitt Romney chose a female running mate, and he bared his chest in an ad to attract the women's vote as he battles State Treasurer Shannon O'Brien.
Done.
We'll end up with at least one woman winning tonight for sure. That's because in Hawaii, both of the candidates are women. We have 5 women governors now. I have seen predictions that we could double that number tonight. Dan?
Well, again, Leslie, we'll see. This election campaign has had no shortage of ugly attack ads and nasty accusations, but when it comes to mudslinging, no state could top Texas. CBS's Bob McNamara is in the muck there.
Texas polling places expected 40% of the state's registered voters to cast ballots, a good turnout for a midterm election. And if nothing else, ending a battle that saw mega millionaire Democrat Tony Sanchez and Republican Governor Rick Perry wage maybe the dirtiest Texas governor's race ever.
Tony Sanchez's bank laundered $25 million in drug money.
One Perry ad even linked Sanchez to the assassination of a federal drug agent.
Just say no to Tony Sanchez.
I think this is outrageous. Rick Perry is a liar.
But Sanchez wasn't timid about portraying Perry as a traffic cop bully caught on tape.
You'll just let us go on, that'd be better.
And a pawn of big insurance.
For vetoes and other favors, there's Rick Perry.
He projected that it would be a nasty and a dirty campaign. He's delivered.
If Perry is right about Sanchez and Sanchez is right about Perry, God save us all. One of them is going to be governor of Texas.
The governor's race was a record-shattering $100 million spending spree, Sanchez using at least $70 million of his own money. Nearly out of the picture was Republican Attorney General John Cornyn's Senate race against Democrat Ron Kirk, the former Dallas mayor.
Kirk cut off at the knees anybody who didn't join his team.
While Cornyn linked Kirk to Hillary Clinton, Cornyn equals scandal was a Kirk reply.
John Cornyn, he received $193,000 from Enron.
Well, the campaigns for governor in the U.S. Senate were some of the most closely contested races here in more than a decade. At least one city won't have all of its votes counted tonight. A programming error in Fort Worth's voting machines means that some 360,000 votes will have to be recounted, and the results may not be known until tomorrow night. Dan?
Bob McNamara with a live report from Dallas. How do voters say they are making their election choices this year? What do they say is on their minds as they cast their ballots? Questions CBS News asked in a poll of likely voters. CBS's Ed Bradley is here with some answers. Ed?
Dan, two issues appear to dominate as voters went to the polls: the economy and the war on terrorism and potential war with Iraq. For the last decade, social issues such as education and health care have dominated. They didn't this year, but it's likely they had some impact in individual races. 28% of Americans picked the economy as their #1 issue. That was evenly spread among Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Republicans mentioned terrorism almost 3-to-1 over Democrats. Trailing were education, health care, and Social Security. Democrats considered those issues more important than did Republicans. Was this election a referendum on President Bush? Well, 27% of likely voters said supporting the president was a factor in their vote for Congress. Half that many said their vote was a vote against the president. The majority said he was not a factor. At a minimum, the president energized Republicans wherever he visited. The administration will probably take some credit if the Republicans do well. If not, Dan, they'll remind us that the president's name was not on the ballot this year.
Ed Bradley, thanks. A reminder, you can get the very latest national and local election returns down to district-by-district counts in each state, plus analysis by clicking on cbsnews.com. Overseas today, Israel's prime minister unexpectedly gave up trying to rebuild his divided government and set parliamentary elections for late January. Ariel Sharon told reporters he didn't want early elections, but felt compelled after his coalition government fell apart. Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to challenge Sharon for leadership of the right-wing Likud party and the country. French police say 8 suspects in an attack last April on the oldest synagogue in Africa have been arrested in southern France. The tanker truck explosion at a 2,000-year-old synagogue in Tunisia killed 19 people, most of them German tourists. And what might be called a stinger sting caught 3 al-Qaeda suspects in Hong Kong. Undercover FBI agents offered to sell 4 U.S. Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. The suspects, 2 Pakistanis and a U.S. citizen of Indian origin, were arrested when they tried to make the purchase. We're going to have more U.S. election news right at the end of this newscast, but coming up next on the CBS Evening News, a serial sniper suspect in court as yet another state looks for a link to an unsolved murder. For 3 weeks, the story overshadowed the election campaign, the serial sniper murders in the Washington, D.C. area. CBS's Bob Orr reports a second suspect, the older one, was denied bail today as investigators now follow the crime trail to the southwest.
Accused serial sniper John Mohammed was whisked by police motorcade from his Baltimore prison cell to a federal courthouse for a detention hearing that was all but a legal formality. Wearing a maroon prison jumpsuit, Mohammed sat impassively as prosecutor Jim Trusty labeled him a flight risk and a danger to the community, noting Mohammed is linked to numerous premeditated and heinous murders. But public defender James Wida called the government's case circumstantial, claiming there's no direct evidence that Mr. Mohammed was at the scene of any of these crimes. Mohammed faces 20 federal charges, ranging from using a firearm in crimes of violence to conspiring in an extortion scheme. That's a death penalty charge stemming from the discovery of a note demanding $10 million found at the site of a sniper attack outside a Virginia steakhouse. But Wida criticized the government for using the extortion charge to keep federal jurisdiction over what should be a local murder case.
This is no longer a murder case. This is an extortion case. If they can't prove extortion, they can't meet their burden of establishing the federal charges.
But Judge Gillen Schultz ordered Mohammed held without bail, saying there's strong evidence of his guilt. Meanwhile, the sniper investigation has stretched to Arizona. Investigators are looking for links in an unsolved murder at a Tucson golf course in mid-March. A man was shot with a rifle. Police say Mohammed and fellow suspect Lee Malvo were in Tucson around that time. While Mohammed and Malvo remain in federal custody, they face murder charges in 4 states. Later this week, Attorney General John Ashcroft is expected to decide which jurisdiction, based on the strongest evidence and toughest laws, will go first with prosecution. Bob Orr, CBS News, Washington.
The Vatican has confirmed that new guidelines being drafted for candidates for the priesthood will address the controversial issue of gay priests. No word on what the guidelines will say, but the first draft reportedly urges the rejection of men with, quote, homosexual tendencies, unquote. Straight ahead on tonight's CBS Evening News, pigs have rights too. Just one of hundreds of ballot initiatives up for a vote today. Picking new leaders was only part of the job facing voters today. There were also more than 200 ballot initiatives, propositions to be voted up or down. In Los Angeles, the question is secession. Measures there would allow the San Fernando Valley and Hollywood to secede from the city of Los Angeles and become independent. If voters approve, the Valley will become America's 6th largest city. The hundreds of initiatives demanding decisions in 40 states are as varied as the communities that put them on the ballot. They range from issues of health and lifestyle to animal rights. CBS's Wyatt Andrews has a sampling.
This year, the issue to some in Florida is, should the pigs go hog wild? No joke, on the Florida ballot is the Pig Protection Amendment, which would free pregnant pigs from the supposed cruelty of living in cages.
We're talking about just allowing them to turn around freely. Is that so much to ask?
Which sounds like a serious question until you hear from farmer Steve Bassford.
They don't need a recliner and an air conditioner and a TV.
And wait till you hear that the 50 sows on his one farm would be the only ones saved.
You're talking about one farmer?
One farmer, one barn.
And I'm talking to him?
You're right.
Ballot initiatives like this are, depending on your politics, either the ugliest or the purest form of American democracy. The hot issue in Berkeley is 6 months in jail for anyone not selling organic or shade-grown coffee. It's about having a social conscience.
As amusing as it might seem to some people, is certainly creating a buzz.
The conscience issue in Arkansas, meanwhile, would make animal cruelty a felony.
The cases of cruelty right here in Arkansas are sickening. A cat hurled from an overpass.
The actual number of ballot initiatives is down this year.
But if you measure by boldness, by the sheer potential for revolution, there has never been an initiative year quite like this.
75,000 voters a day.
In Oregon, for example, two 22-year-olds pushed universal health care onto the ballot. Free health care with just a few exceptions.
I mean, we're not going to go buy you Calvin Klein eyeglasses, you know.
And 3 states might legalize some form of marijuana. 3 ounces would be legal in Nevada. And just in case you're wondering,
that's 250 marijuana cigarettes.
Soon we will know the real will of the voters. Will they decriminalize pot and criminalize coffee? Will cat tossing in Arkansas become a serious crime? Will one state constitution be amended to finally free the Florida 50? Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, Grand Ridge, Florida.
We'll be back with more steady, reliable election night coverage, quick when possible, but cautious when called for, when the CBS Evening News continues, so stay here with us. Here is a CBS election update as we approach 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Polls are about to close in the first 5 states: Kentucky, Vermont, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. Very tight races are indicated in South Carolina and Georgia. The Senate race in Georgia is in fact one of the tightest in the country, with Republican Saxby Chambliss mounting a very strong bid to unseat incumbent Democrat Max Cleland. The Democrats lose in Georgia, they're in a heap of trouble, son. We have no hard numbers yet, of course, but it does appear that voter turnout perhaps was better than expected in at least some states, including Texas, where the campaign for governor was one of the nastiest down and dirty in memory. That's part of our world tonight. CBS will be back on the air with election updates throughout the evening, and then CBS News will bring you an hour-long election special at 10/9 Central. For the CBS Evening News, Dan Rather reporting from CBS News Election Headquarters and Accuracy Central in New York. Stay with us. More returns in a moment.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com. AOL keyword CBS News. This is CBS.